Welcome in. It's week 12. We're here with Football Guys. It's the DFS show. Unfortunately, our fearless leader, Devin Knotts, is not able to join us this week. Devin is moving, so Devin's very busy with that. But we are here with Dan Hendry, and we got an upgrade here with Dan. Dan is one of the smartest minds at Football Guys. We're thrilled that Dan was able to join us, and myself, Jeff Bell, with Phil Alexander as well. We're going to dive into our GPPs, our cash game plays, looking at DraftKings. We usually start with games of the week. Phil, why don't you go ahead, lead us off? What games are you looking at here in week 12 NFL?
Yeah, it's a really interesting slate, Jeff. It's kind of like, do you want to target the runaway games or the run back games? We've got three games on this slate with double digit spreads where the favorite has an implied team total of 27 or more. And then we've got four other games that have similar game totals, but Vegas is suggesting that they're going to go back and forth. So those heavy favorites are the Lions minus 10.5 versus the Giants, the Seahawks minus 13.5 at the Titans, and the Ravens minus 13.5 versus the Jets. And then we've got the closer games. Patriots at Bengals has a 50.5 point total. That's another one that started out with the Patriots as more than a touchdown favorite, but it looks like the possibility that we might see Joe Burrow this week has Vegas rethinking that line, and that's moved 3 points. It's now Patriots minus 5.5. So that one is definitely interesting. Colts at Chiefs looks like a marquee game. Chiefs minus 3.5 at home, 50.5 total. We have the return of a five-figure salary on DraftKings in that game with Jonathan Taylor at $10,000. The first time we've seen that in some time. Jags at Cardinals. That one could go either way, but Vegas has a 47.5 point total on it, and those teams could get kind of sloppy in a shootout too. So I guess I could see it. And then Eagles at Cowboys, another good one. Eagles minus 3 on the road, 47.5 point total. And we'll see if that Dallas defense is what Philadelphia needs to get its offense back on track.
Yeah, Dan, are there any other games that you're keeping an eye on? And if not, maybe kind of how do you feel with Joe Burrow potentially going in there, that Bengals game?
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of my favorite games on the slate. I think there's one of the big things, and we'll probably talk about it a little more when we get back to running back, is kind of trying to figure out the Travion Henderson, Ramondre Stevenson split because the Bengals have just been getting destroyed by running backs. So just a great spot for the Patriots. I think one of the things I do in my weekly first look article is look at both team totals and then compare those to the team's average on the season. So the Patriots, one of the teams that are projected to score 3 points higher than their season average, which is always kind of nice because the prices are based on those season averages. And then just extremely good defense versus position matchups for quarterback, running back, and tight end. I think the Ravens are pretty interesting this week. They're kind of 15% scoring boost compared to their normal weekly total. And then I think you take some of those defense versus position numbers for the Jets with a huge grain of salt, just without their two best defensive players. And then kind of a low total game that I think is at least somewhat interesting, the Saints and the Falcons, just because the guys are so cheap. And, the 20.5 point team total for the Saints is not anything impressive, but it's so much higher than their season average. And we just saw Carolina throw for 448 yards against this defense. So that's another spot where the total maybe doesn't jump out overall, but at least kind of within the context of how the Saints have performed on the season, kind of an interesting spot there.
Yeah, good call out there. I know last week when we were talking, we had lamented not having the Cowboys and Bengals defense on last week's main slate. We've got both this week. I'm kind of curious on, so Dallas has been a lot worse against the pass than against the run, and the Bengals kind of inverse, a lot worse against the run. And is it like you feeling that is because of just the ease of being able to attack the Bengals on the ground? So why bother with the pass, or are the Bengals somewhere that a good Drake May or a Stephon Diggs would be off limits?
So I think the Bengals' entire issue this season has been missed tackles. I saw a stat they have 4 of the top 5 leaders in missed tackles are all on the Bengals defense. So that's showing up all over the place. I mean, you think back to some of like the highlight plays of the year where it's just like tight ends bouncing off tacklers for these long gains, or running backs kind of catching these dump offs out of the backfield and just like nobody there. And then, if a guy does get there, he misses. The linebacker play has been especially bad. They're starting two rookies and they both look overmatched. So I think we're really looking at players who have some run after the catch ability, and especially the guys who are going to be matched up against those linebackers like Hunter Henry, like Trevion Henderson. So to me, that's where I'd kind of focus a little bit more than like Stephon Diggs. So the Bengals are only giving up, according to my numbers, a little bit less than 1 point per game above average to opposing wide receiver groups. So they're kind of average against wide receivers, but just dead last against running backs, dead last against tight ends, and then like bottom 5 against quarterbacks. So kind of pick your poison there, but I think really you're looking for some run after the catch guys would be the guys I'd target against Cincinnati.
Yeah, we're gonna dive into our cash games now and hit quarterbacks. But Phil, first off, you nailed this Cardinals triple stack last week. You deserve some praise there. It's a good call there. That I know that was a big winner across the board. But what are you looking here for your quarterbacks? You looking to go back to Jacoby Brissett again, or are you looking a different direction? Because we've got some injuries that have opened some things up, and some guys that are returning from injuries, and that seems to be really the theme of this week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'm going to keep on riding the gravy train with biscuit wheels that is Jacoby Brissett and all of those pass attempts. We're now at 5 starts, 5 games over 20 DraftKings points. In 4 of those games, he's got at least 36 pass attempts. In 3 of those games, at least 44. He just set the world record for completions in a game last week, for Christ's sake. I mean, it's really all breaking Jacoby Brissett's way. This week's game looks good for some points again. I will say, like for this week, it's really not like last week where I was literally in favor of like a triple stack, even in cash games with Jacoby Brissett. You do have to wonder at some point, like, we looked at Joe Flacco last week, like, is his time up? And the clock always seemed to strike midnight on these guys like Ryan Fitzpatrick and, Jacoby Brissett's another one of these guys. And if you look at the opponents during the stretch of games that he's been good, you got Indy, Green Bay, Dallas, Seattle, San Francisco. Those are all offenses that could force those pass heavy game scripts. And Jacksonville is just so uneven. So I'm playing him. I'm not feeling as good about it as I was last week. I will say that much. I'd love to get up to one of the more expensive guys at the top of the slate, but I didn't see how it was possible, even with some of the value that's opened up. So curious to see where you and Dan land on that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think Brissett is the play this week, and I actually do like the triple stack in cash. I just don't see how you can go against Trey McBride at that price. Like if he was a wide receiver, I feel like he'd be priced like 8,500
Mm-hmm.
or so, and they just refuse to price him up because he's a tight end. And then Michael Wilson at sub 5,000. We'll get to some of that stuff, but I like those guys. All 4 of the kind of quarterbacks in that 6,600 to 6,900 range are nice if you can get there. Drake May, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, and even Jalen Hurts, potentially a bounce back spot there against the Cowboys. So like if you can get to one of those 4, like that's kind of how your salary breaks down. That's great. If not, I do like Brissett there at 5,300 as my number one guy.
Jackson Dark's coming back this week at 5,600. Is it because the Lions defense has been pretty strong there? Is it concerns about just his return weapons around him? But we've seen him be incredibly productive as for the fantasy purposes for the last couple of weeks.
So, yeah, he's an okay option. I am a little worried that they'll dial back the running now that Dable's not there, that he's coming off of a concussion, because the passing numbers have been just okay. And so you're really counting on, I think he had was it a touchdown in 6 straight games, rushing touchdown? Like
Yeah.
that's the stuff that feels a little bit more fragile with the concussion and the change in coaching staff. So I'm not probably going there in cash, but I do kind of understand the play.
Yeah, I like it a little bit better in tournaments because I do wonder how long it's going to take to coach that part of his game out of him. He really just seems like the kind of guy who's 100% balls to the wall the entire time. So we'll see. I think it's interesting for tournaments because I think we're going to see way more people play the Detroit side of that game, and it might be interesting, to do like a single stack with Dart and then play all the Detroit guys going back the other way.
All right, we're gonna move on to running backs here. I do owe our DFS great community an apology. I was all over the Sean Tucker play last week when we did the Sunday morning start sit show. I didn't get there quite yet by Thursday, so I wish I would have given that out here to the people. But that turned out pretty good. But last week we had that smash from Bijan Robinson in the most. Everybody's talking about Tyler Algier and the goal line and all those things. So that was the most classic spot for Bijan Robinson here. We've already mentioned the 5-digit price tag or the 4-digit price tag on Jonathan Taylor. So we starting at the top here on cash game plays with running backs. Or Dan, I'll start with you. Where you feel like you're going to go with running backs here this week?
Yeah, so I think if you pay up, I like Gibbs, the best of these guys. Had 146 yards last week against Philly, who's a great run defense. 172 yards, 3 touchdowns the week before. And then he gets the Giants this week. They're giving up the second most running back points above expectation. So just a great matchup, a spot where I just feel really good about them bouncing back. It's a game they need, and it's a big step down after they've faced some really tough defenses. I think if I'm paying up, he's the guy I'm going for. One of the cheap running backs I like this week is Kenneth Walker, 5,400. Titans they've been playing a little bit better on defense lately, but they're still a top 5 matchup for opposing running backs. Seattle's favored by 13. I think they're going to run the ball a lot. Just, I think Darnold looked a little shaky last week, and part of that, maybe they try to get him back on track, but I'm getting the impression that they want to take a little bit of the pressure off him and really get the running game going. And we started to see Kenneth Walker's usage tick up. He has 30 carries over the last 2 weeks. The coaches are talking up his role as a pass catcher. And there have been multiple, like both the offensive coordinator and head coach this week are saying like he's earned more opportunities. And I know we've kind of like heard that before, so it does feel like a little shaky, but it just like if you watch the games, he's just better than Charbonnet. And as they're kind of building towards the playoffs, I think they're going to start leaning on him a little bit more. I think they wanted to get him through this season. He's a guy who's had trouble staying healthy, but now that we're kind of getting to that point in the year, he's a guy who I think they're going to just start ramping him up. I know that's maybe a little thin for a cash game play, but with him all the way down at 5,400 and Tennessee Seattle favored by 13, he was the cheap guy that stood out to me. And then there's 3 situations that I'm kind of taking a wait and see approach on. So I know this is a little bit of a hedge, but the first one, the big one, is Josh Jacobs, just trying to figure out if he's going to play. It feels really close to 50-50. I think if I was betting on it, I'd say he probably does play. But if he does end up sitting, Emmanuel Wilson's only 5,300, and I think he'll be popular and viable. One that I mentioned earlier, the Ramondre Stevenson return. Excuse me. And I'm pretty confident he is going to play, but I really want to kind of be on the lookout for any hints we get from like the beat writers, any statements from Vrabel in terms of like, is he just going to come back and be the starter, or is kind of like the genie out of the bottle with Trevion Henderson? Because again, like, and this one probably more of a tournament play, but both guys very low ownership projected right now. And I already mentioned like the Bengals just can't stop anybody. So it's like they've given up 30 plus points to opposing running back rooms just week after week after week. So both those guys are really interesting. And then the last guy I want to mention is Bashal Tutin. Travis Etienne was in a non-contact jersey practice today with a shoulder injury. And my gut feeling is that he plays, but this could be kind of like the excuse they need to get Tutin more involved. Like his role has been trending up. He had 15 carries last week, 75 yards. And the coaching staff is really kind of talking him up too. So that's a really interesting spot to me, just because he's only 4,600 on DK. So if we kind of get some indications that ETN is limited, or especially if he's out, um, I think Tootin becomes really interesting, just as like a very, very cheap running back.
So
Yeah, you
I'm
touch
sorry, I'm on the road this week, and I haven't been able to stay on top of the news cycle quite as much as usual. I know that Tootin left last week's game early with an ankle injury. Is he back practicing? Like, or is that something potentially to look out for too?
So the report out today was he was practicing as normal, just no limitations, and then they had ETN in a red no
Okay.
contact jersey. So he was kind of practicing, but no contact, which again, my kind of read on it is that ETN will probably play, but if they kind of want to see what they have in Tootin, and again, it's kind of going back to some of these coaching comments, they've really started to talk Tootin up, where like we've seen this in years past, where this was kind of when Bucky Irving started to emerge for Cohen last year, where it's just like Rashad White was there and there and there, and then it was finally like, we got to get this rookie some more touches, and he's starting to look a little bit better. And they also mentioned how well he's just not losing yards, so he's keeping them on schedule. Where ETN's a little like hit or miss, so I think they're kind of angling it towards maybe Tootin getting the goal line work and stuff. And an interesting matchup with Arizona. Again, probably more of a tournament play unless we get some really hard news that ETN is limited or out. But with all those Brissett stacks, I think Tootin's a fun bring back there.
Yep, that would definitely change
yeah,
the calculus on cash games. Sorry, Jeff, I keep stepping on
you're
you.
good, man. No worries at all. No, it was one of those that Tootin said he was fine, kind of right after the
Okay.
game, and then I think both that situation and I think the Pittsburgh situation, Warren kind of said something similar, that it was just blowout games for the Jaguars and the Steelers that led into those backfields shifting versus long term or short term injury concerns. The mention it's impossible not to mention Travion Henderson going up against the Bengals along with that return from Stevenson. But I think that you touched on Dan there of just kind of, I feel like it's almost a gift for tournament play, basically, of like, because everybody would be all over that Henderson matchup against the Bengals without that. So Phil, where are you looking at here for your cash game plays at running back position?
Yeah, so I was having a difficult time. I want to get up to like a Gibbs or a Bijan Robinson, but once again, I couldn't do it, even with the cheap quarterback. So you kind of have to pick on this slate, I think, where you want to spend that one like 8,000 plus slot in your lineup, and I preferred wide receiver. So I had Chase Brown at 6,200. He's got an objectively bad matchup against New England. They haven't allowed more than 58 yards to an opposing runner in any game this season. So that's bad. But the $6,200 price tag on Brown doesn't reflect his role without Samaje Perine in the lineup. He's basically back to being the Chase Brown that we saw at the end of last season. 90 to 95% of the snaps, all of the routes, great usage in the passing game with 22 targets over the last 2 weeks. And with Burrow starting to feel likely to play, that the preseason thesis was that he was going to be one of the league leaders in touchdowns. So now some of that additional upside gets restored. I think he's definitely viable despite the bad matchup. I think the price is pretty soft. The other one, yeah, is going to be a wait and see, especially now with Tootin in the mix. But Emmanuel Wilson was also a guy that I was considering, but every time that you read a Josh Jacobs report today, you felt one way or the other about him playing. So I don't know. I think the last thing I read made me feel as though Jacobs is going to be back without missing time, which is great for him because that seemed like it could have been a bad injury when it happened. Um, what about Alvin Kamara at 5,500? So I haven't played Alvin Kamara in anything this whole season. I drafted him a bunch and traded him away early in all of my season long leagues. It just kind of seems over for him. But even though I'm not trying to play old guys at this time of year, I think I'd make an exception. He's getting a lot of touches still. He's still dominating the backfield. Atlanta's rush defense. Um, we've been picking on them lately, and he's only 5,500. So I don't know. I wish the touchdown equity was a little bit higher, but
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one. I wish he was getting a few more. I mean, the touchdown equity, of course, is an issue. He hasn't scored since week one. I just wish he was getting a few more targets. Like they're not throwing him screens, which just seems like malpractice almost. Just he hasn't had more than 3 targets in the last 3 or 4 weeks. But he did have 22 carries last week, and I think there is a case being made that Tyler Shuck maybe raises the floor of this offense a little bit, raises the ceiling a little bit too. He actually looked pretty good last week, at least, compared to what they were doing before. I think he had 282 yards and, led them to a win on the road against Carolina before the bye. So I think he's injected a little bit of life there. So I think it's interesting. I wish we were getting a few more targets there because, like you said, you're not going to get the touchdowns. He's probably not going to rack up a ton of yards. That was all great when you could kind of count on 4 or 5 catches at least, but now it's not there anymore. So that one's a
yeah,
little tough.
Yeah, it's narrative street, but to look at that and see the Falcons get just ripped apart by Bryce Young, and then now you lose Drake London, you lose Michael Penix, you can't help but wonder if just the give up mode might be fully activated there in Atlanta. We haven't talked about Saquon Barkley at 7,500 going up against Dallas. I mean, that feels like Saquon Barkley has played much, much better the last couple of weeks. He's gotten rolling there a little bit. The Chase Brown call there. Chase Brown's got 100 scrimmage yards in 4 consecutive games. One more game with 100 scrimmage yards would tie him with he holds the team record along with a handful of other players that hold 5 consecutive 100 scrimmage yard games. The other one that we haven't touched a little bit yet here, and it's definitely also a little bit narrative street, Aaron Jones at 5,700 going into Green Bay. That he's kind of been the lead back there for Minnesota. I know that Minnesota offense has really struggled with JJ McCarthy, but that feels like a spot that Aaron Jones, I know last year was a big deal for him to go back to Green Bay. So we'll see how that one stacks up. Let's get wide receivers here. Phil, where are you looking at for your wide receivers here for cash game
yeah, I
plays?
think I'm going to start with Michael Wilson at 4,800. He looked stellar last week, obviously. I had mentioned when we went over that I felt that not only was he good for cash games, but I would even play him in GPPs at high ownership because I thought that he definitely did have a ceiling that we haven't seen. He exceeded my expectations, of course. I wasn't expecting, 18 targets or whatever it was that he had, but he looked great on the contested catch downfield stuff that I saw. I think he's a great fit with Brissett. And the Jaguars give up about 8 more fantasy points to outside receivers than their season average. So it's a great matchup against those Jacksonville outside corners for him. The $1,000 price bump is unfortunate, but also warranted, and he's still below 5K. So I think he's good. Second guy I was looking at was Jamison Williams at 5,700. So 2 games now with Dan Campbell calling the plays, and Williams has 26.8 and 19.7 DraftKings points in those games. Long catch of at least 40 yards in both. You got Sam Laporta hitting IR to consolidate some targets. And this matchup against the Giants has been just a money printer for receivers this season. Listeners have heard me say a bunch of times now that they play man coverage at the second highest rate in the league, and they're very bad at it, yet they stay committed to it. So, especially speed has been killing them, and we know that Williams has it. I think he's got a floor now with Laporta out and Campbell calling the plays, and I think his ceiling in this matchup is like 35 points. So I want him in all formats. Um, and then the last wide receiver spot is where I'm spending, and my first choice probably would have been Amon-Ra St. Brown, but I don't love putting him and Williams next to each other in a cash game lineup for some reason. Um, I don't know. The math might say I'm wrong for that because they're both in great spots, but I went with Rashee Rice 7,700. Down week last week, but they were playing Denver, and that was in Denver. The entire offense really struggled. Still had 9 targets. Vegas is expecting the Kansas City offense to wake up. They've got a 27-point team total. And if they do hit it, it's hard to imagine Rice not having at least one touchdown. Not sure if Sauce Gardner is going to shadow him, but even if he does, I'm not sure that it really matters. Drake London didn't seem to have a big problem with it in London. And I just see a multi touchdown game here. I think Rice is also good for GPPs and cash. So I think what we might be seeing is like some pretty flat ownership across the running back and the wide receiver groups. So I like those weeks for tournaments, especially because I'm really not sure how those picks would stack up with yours or Dan's. They don't feel chalky to me.
Definitely, I'm on Jameson Williams. I like that one a lot, and I think Wilson is a good call out there. Jacksonville has been pretty decent against wide receivers, but I think that after what we saw last week, good to go back there. But I think those are really good calls. Dan, what are you feeling here?
Yeah, those were my two kind of for sure. And then I actually very similar thinking to Phil when I was kind of building these lineups. Like I ended up landing on Gibbs instead of St. Brown and trying to pay down for the third wide receiver. But like that's kind of I was kind of weighing St. Brown and like one of the cheap running backs or paying up a little bit and trying to find another kind of third value wide receiver in the mid range. And part of that, I'm waiting a little bit on news. Like, I want to know what's going on with Brian Thomas Jr. Jacoby Myers is really cheap this week, 4,600. He had 5 catches for 64 yards last week, and that was about 10, 12 days after being traded. So they're coming off the bye week. I'm expecting him to play, the vast majority of the snaps and be the number one target if Thomas is out, but still just kind of waiting on the Thomas news. Like I think he was limited in practice today, and that one feels like a true 50-50. So those are kind of the guys I'm looking at. And I definitely agree on Wilson and Williams were like the two guys who kind of instantly I thought made the most sense.
Yeah, I think that, T. Higgins probably merits a mention. Definitely a difficult matchup, but he's been excellent even with Jamar chasing the lineup. Without chasing the lineup, that opens wide up for him. And Jackson Smith and Jigba at the very top. It's really hard to get there and probably cash, but if you like to go through and not mention him, it's hard to do. Tight ends, we're probably all over Trey McBride, I would have to imagine, given how everything's going. Is there any other thought at all in cash games about any other different direction?
Not for me.
I would say no unless you decide you want to go with 2, which I think is a viable strategy this week. If you want McBride in there, you can go down to Mark Andrews is 3,800. He has 6 touchdowns in 6 games with Lamar Jackson this season. And then, I think I mentioned earlier, I think McBride just really favorably compares to the running backs and wide receivers in that range. Like I'm taking Trey McBride over, Chase Brown for $600 extra, or, some of those wide receivers. Like I think he has a similar projection to Rashee Rice, and he's $900 cheaper. So if you kind of consider him as a flex, then you can maybe get to the second running back or second tight end. But I don't see how you fade him if you're just playing one tight end.
Yeah, if Devin were here, he would be yelling at me because the Bills are playing right now. So it's hard for me not to, out of the corner of my eye to see what's happening. But let's look now at our GPP plays. Open up the board. Look at quarterbacks here. GPP quarterbacks. Where are we feeling with our quarterbacks, Dan?
I'm intrigued by Lamar Jackson. I feel like he's just due for one of those big games, and it's a bounce back spot. Like last week, he did not look great against Cleveland, but it was so windy, and that's such a good defense. And now he gets the Jets this week, and it feels like one of those where they need this offense to get back on track. Like they struggled really bad last week, and I could just kind of feel like one of those, a little bit like Josh Allen last week, where he's just like, it's not the dream matchup, and he's probably only going to be 5 to 10% owned, maybe slightly higher. I'm guessing kind of in that 5 to 10% range. And he's one of those guys who, once you kind of forget about his ceiling, he'll have one of those games where he reminds you. And at just 6,700, I really like him. I already mentioned Andrews is just a really cheap stacking partner if you want to go that way. One other guy, I mentioned Shuck earlier. I don't love going there, but he's one path to, if you do think like JSN or Jonathan Taylor or one of these really expensive guys goes off. Shuck's only 4,400. And again, we just saw Bryce Young tear up this same defense. Shuck's at home. He threw for 282 and 2 in his first start. And they seem to be more willing to throw it downfield and let him just kind of sit back and go for it than they were with what's his name? Blanking.
Rattler.
Rattler.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that was a little bit interesting. Again, only if you kind of feel really strongly about some of these really high priced guys at other positions. He's maybe a path to get there where if, Taylor has one of those 40-point weeks, then maybe all you do need is like 20 or so from a very cheap Tyler Shuck.
Yeah, I got one that's down in that range too. I like Tyrod Taylor at 4,300. Yeah,
Revenge
it
game.
is a revenge game, and I think he's got a little bit of that fun bad in him. At the very least, he could still run a little. He had 48 yards, I think, in his spot start against Tampa Bay earlier this year. He could still push the ball down the field. Had 18.7 DraftKings points in that game, despite playing terribly in real life. So I don't know. The Jets have some interesting like cast-offs at wide receiver that I've always kind of liked. John Mechie and Adonai Mitchell. So I don't know. Like I don't know if I'm. Are you living if you're not like stacking Tyrod Taylor with AD Mitchell this week? I don't know if you are.
I had a note like, in the wide receiver section to ask you about AD Mitchell and kind of your thoughts there because he's 3,200, and I mean you have a stack there for 6,500 with Taylor and Mitchell, which
I
again it's one of those if you're trying to get up to Gibbs, you're trying to get up to JSN, like it can make some
Personally, I like
sense.
probably like the John Mechie side a little bit more than the Adonai Mitchell side. Just Mechie played pretty well towards the end of that game last week, and I think that when you look at, it kind of gave Mitchell his shot, I think a little bit, and we saw how that went. I mean, there's nothing to lose, so you would think you'd go back to it again just because keep doing it. But Mechie did look pretty good.
and then
Jalen Hurts, I mean, going up against Dallas defense, I mean, we double circle every time that Dallas defense is potentially there. And by a similar token, you do have that Drake May going up against the Bengals defense with maybe with Joe Burrow back in the lineup, that the Bengals can push that strong Patriots defense to keep that game rolling and keep that game moving. Phil, did I cut you off? Did you have something else?
just Trevor Lawrence at 5,100. I'm not super confident in him, but the same thing that I was talking about at the top of the show with playing the Giants side as the game stack there against the Lions. I kind of like the idea of pegging this game for a shootout, but taking the Jaguar side and going with Lawrence and Dan mentioned Jacoby Myers looks pretty good. Do we know if Brenton Strange is coming back this week? I know they opened his window last week, but not sure if he's practicing. But
The last I read, he is practicing. The last I read was basically some speculation from the Jaguar side of they have an open roster spot, like more or less of like they've made room for Strange to be
okay,
available.
I liked his role in the offense early in the season, so that could be something else to consider. But Jacksonville's got a 25-point total. That's respectable. If he could just have like one day, Lawrence, where he gets it together as a passer. Cohen is letting him run, and he's especially letting him run near the goal line. Uh, I think it's 3 rushing touchdowns in his last 3 games. So if he could finally have like a solid passing performance, I could see Lawrence going for 30 and showing up in a first place tournament lineup.
Yeah, I like that mention and kind of operating in that range. And you know that the ceiling is potentially there. I feel like the ceiling is open for everybody now after Bryce Young's 448 yards out of the blue last week against the Falcons defense that had previously been one of the strongest against the pass. Running backs here, Phil. I'll just tap you back again to go with running backs here. You ready to go?
Yep. So you mentioned Saquon Barkley earlier. He was on my list for running backs. The Eagles seem like they're trying to force it with him and get him going. He's got 48 carries combined over his last 2 games. Uh, Pretty interesting, right? That Dallas really put the clamps on Ashton Ginty last week in Quinton Williams' first game, shoring up that defensive line. But I'll take some chances on Barkley breaking some explosive plays in that Dallas game and just having the game go high scoring. Um, I think you already nailed it with Travion Henderson's ownership being a potential gift. I think I'll be playing it that way in tournaments. Like looking back on it, would we? How bad would we feel that we didn't play Travion Henderson against the Bengals because of Ramondre Stevenson when Henderson is the only running back that's given that backfield anything all year? It's not like Stevenson was playing well before he got hurt. He might have fallen into the end zone once or twice, but yeah, give me the guy who breaks explosive plays in the cupcake matchup. And then the Jaguars backfield, like Dan was talking about, is the other nut that we still have to crack from an injury perspective. But I thought ETN looked pretty good last week. Tootin definitely looked good last week. They're kind of both dealing with an injury. This one is harder for me than New England because New England, I have a definite lean towards Henderson. Here, I wouldn't know what to do if both of them were active, but I feel like we're going to see someone score some fantasy points out of that backfield this week.
I'm sorry, Josh Allen just went down really hard, and he's like, yeah, okay, Dan, go.
I think a lot of my the guys I mentioned in cash games aren't projected to be super popular in tournaments, so they make great options there. I already mentioned Kenneth Walker, just a great matchup, only 5,400. I am kind of intrigued with the possibility of trying to save some money with guys like Walker and Tootin, potentially Emmanuel Wilson, to get up to some of those really high end wide receivers. One guy we haven't mentioned, at least worth mentioning for tournaments, is Derrick Henry. He's had 100 yards 2 of the last 3 weeks, including at Cleveland, which is one of the toughest spots for running backs. And it seems like with Lamar Jackson getting a little bit healthier, a nice matchup where they're, again, projected for 29 points against the Jets. You could just see him kind of having one of those games where he gets one of those long galloping down the field touchdowns and he gets maybe like a short touchdown too. And he's actually had 2 or 3 catches each of the last few weeks also. So I think he's a guy who you have to remember at this time of year.
DeAndre Swift's played really, really well in taking control of that backfield to get back. A little bit of a difficult matchup against a Pittsburgh defense, but I think that could be an area to explore. If Isaiah Pacheco is not back yet, Kareem Hunt at 5,100, the yardage hasn't been there, but he has just dominated the touches in the backfield, and that's another area at 5,100. You could get a couple of touchdowns in a game that game could shoot out against the Colts and the Chiefs. I think Tootin was a good call. We mentioned that. I'm kind of just running through my sheet. I think that's about everything I've got on my sheet. Let's look at wide receivers here. And Dan, I'll just hit you up back with wide receivers.
Yeah, I think Chris Olave is interesting. We just saw Tedero McMillan go off last week. We got a dome game for Tyler Shuck, his first home start. So Olave at 6,400, kind of in that range that might go a little bit overlooked. I have one really cheap guy who I think is interesting, and that's Mitch Tinsley for the Bengals. I think T. Higgins is probably going to get shadow coverage from Christian Gonzalez, or at least see a lot of him. And I think that's actually a tough matchup for Higgins. And it sounds like Tinsley is just going to step straight into the starting lineup for Chase and play almost every down, or 70-80%. And the coaching staff just gushes about him. He was Burrow's guy in the preseason. Every time he's gotten an opportunity, he just makes plays. And like, he's 3,000 minimum price on DK. I think he's only projected for 1 or 2% ownership. I think if I'm taking a shot on any of the Cincinnati pass catchers this week, I like Tinsley. He's just like, both in preseason and I think he caught a really impressive touchdown against the Jaguars, and he just hasn't been able to get on the field because Chase, Higgins, and Yoshvash. But the team loves him, and this is kind of his shot. I also think there's kind of like a narrative element where like the Bengals have some guys who've been highly drafted who just don't care enough. And Tinsley, they really praised him for being like a self-made guy. And it's just like he's earned every opportunity. And I have a feeling with kind of a lost season and just trying to kind of get some vibes back in the right direction. And he's a fan favorite at home. I really think they try to get Tinsley a touchdown. And I think he also projects for like 6 to 8 targets too at minimum price. So he's my cheap guy who I'm really excited about. One more cheap guy I think worth mentioning, Luther Burden, is 3,600. His playing time's ticked up. He's about 50% of the snaps each of the last 2 weeks. Just 8 targets total over that time. But he's another where like Ben Johnson has been starting to say like, all right, he's earning more opportunities. And we see this every year with these kind of highly drafted rookie wide receivers who are talented. They get stuck behind these kind of middling vets for a little while. And then at some point, it's just like, all right, we got to unleash this guy. And I think that could be Burden this week. So I like him at 3,600.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know if we're allowed this week to make fantasy football content without mentioning Luther Burden and probably Christian Watson as well. I think that's just mandated by the fantasy gods at this point. But Phil, where are you leaning here on your wide receivers?
Yeah, Mitchell Tinsley, I got to write that one down. Dan did a nice sell job there.
This is a really good week to have Dan
Yeah.
on, but like frustrating week, but like Dan's got some insight here.
I'll go with a slightly more obvious name in Jackson Smith and Jigba. So at $9,000, he's really hard to squeeze into a cash lineup like we said. But I mean, this guy is like sun running on efficiency all season, and it's at the point where I refuse to bet against it. Like, what is Tennessee going to throw at Seattle to stop Jackson Smith and Jigba? Like, it is literally laughable. He should have a huge game. Zay Flowers at 6,300. Um, we've kind of seen it the last couple of weeks because before Gardner got traded, he was out with a concussion. And when Sauce Gardner was still on the Jets, it would always be the wide receiver 2 on the opposition who would go off because Sauce would be shutting down the number 1. But ever since Gardner's been out of the lineup, like it doesn't matter who it is, you're able to pass on the Jets, whether it's Mac Hollins, Jerry Jeudy, Diggs last week. It just doesn't matter. So um, I think if Lamar Jackson gets on track, and I agree with Dan that he should in this one, I think Flowers is the beneficiary. And we get back to the point that we were at early in the season where he was showing a ceiling to go along with the floor. And the price is pretty good there. And then 7,100 for Higgins. You know, it's interesting. I kind of expected him to be at the top of the projected ownership lists, and he wasn't with Chase out. And I guess the Christian Gonzalez matchup is a solid reason why. But I wonder what happens to him, especially if maybe Burrow's back in the lineup, or if that'll even make a difference considering how well the pass catchers have been performing with Joe Flacco. But Higgins as a target hog, I think I want some exposure to that.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
sorry, I was gonna say one of my favorite stats like lately has been like when the Bengals scored 20 points, T. Higgins scores a touchdown. It's 9 out of the last 10 games. So it's just like as long as the Bengals have any kind of semblance of decent offense, like it ends up with Higgins scoring at least one. So in those 10 games, I think he has 14 touchdowns when they've scored 20 points. So he's had some multi-touchdown games and then that kind of one touchdown floor. So I do like it. I wish he was like a slightly cheaper than 7,100, but they did price him up a bit.
Yeah, Higgins is going for an NFL record. If he scores a touchdown here, it's I think it's 9 consecutive home games he's caught a touchdown pass in. I think right now he's tied with, I know it's Jerry Rice, and there's one other receiver that he's tied with for the most consecutive touchdowns in a home game, which feels like the most ridiculous cherry picking stat possible, but that is out there. But I think Phil, I really like the point that you made about Quinnen Williams and about shutting down Ashton Denty, and then you're seeing an Eagles offense that doesn't have Lane Johnson. I mean, you got AJ Brown and you got Devonta Smith sitting here. And the corners have gotten healthier for Dallas, and maybe Dallas is just a little bit of a better defensive team than what we'd expect. But it does feel like there's got to be something there for a Devonta Smith or an AJ Brown in a tournament play. In terms of the Higgins, like I do kind of, if it's not going to be under owned, then I mean, Drake London. I mean, why didn't Christian Gonzalez shut down Drake London? I mean, Drake London, I think it was 3 touchdowns against the Patriots, but Alec Pierce, we haven't mentioned him at 5,000 flat. I think that's a little bit of it should be probably more of a defensive leaning game potentially. But again, the Chiefs and the Colts could shoot out there. I mean, Darnell Mooney gross at 4,800 could just get a ton of targets potentially for Kirk Cousins stepping in. Mac Hollins has been really good at 4,200, just a different direction to look into attacking that Bengals defense. And that's, if you want to go 3,000 flat, you have Roman Wilson sitting down there too. He looked like he pulled ahead as the wide receiver 2 potentially for the Steelers. That's just bottom of the barrel if you wanted to try to look and find something cheap. Tight ends. Is there anything on tight ends that we're sitting here looking at GPP Plays?
I like Travis Kelce this week. That's one of the ways you can get after the Colts defense. They give up the 4th most points per game above expectation to tight ends. He had 13 targets last week, and if you think maybe Gardner does limit Rice a little bit, then it could be another like big Kelce week, especially I think Worthy's banged up. I'm assuming he'll play, but he doesn't seem to be fully healthy. I think he tweaked something again in practice this week. So yeah, if Gardner can kind of limit Rice to not a huge game, then Kelce makes a ton of sense. He's only 5,000. And again, I also think he compares pretty favorably to the wide receivers and running backs in that range too. So you can consider these 2 tight end lineups.
Yeah, I've got Brock Bowers at 6K. I just think if you're not going to play McBride, you're at such risk of losing so many points to the opposition. And if we're thinking about it in terms of who could actually put up a comparable score, I think Bowers is probably at the top of that list. 12 targets last week, second time he's reached that number in 3 games since returning from a PCL sprain. The Raiders obviously know they need to get him the ball to have a shot to win games. They could potentially win that game big if Shedeur Sanders is a disaster, or if he's as disastrous as he was coming in as the backup last week. And Dallas Goedert at 4,200. Speaking of the Eagles pass catchers against Dallas, again, not sure if he could keep pace with McBride, but he's one of the few tight ends out there with multi-touchdown upside. And then Dan would actually be the perfect guy to answer this for me. Bengals tight ends, right? So we've seen it in the past where when one of the big wide receivers is out, the tight end usually produces. Only now we've got Mike Gesicki back at practice, still on IR, hasn't been activated, but I think he's going full at 2,600. Noah Fant has been the primary pass catcher at 3,100. Tanner Hudson pops his head up every now and then at 2,500. Like, I feel like one of these guys is catching a touchdown. I'm not sure which though. Do you have a lean there, Dan?
I think my lean would be Fant. He's been playing pretty well, and he actually, like early in the week before I realized Gesicki was probably going to be back, Fant was kind of on my short list. But now it's just messy because I don't know what to expect there in terms of how they split it up. I do think Fant provides a little bit more as a blocker, and I think they are starting to like him. And with Gesicki missing so much time, I think Fant's the safer play. But Gesicki for that cheap, you have to consider him. And then the other guy I didn't mention, but should kind of in this matchup, is Hunter Henry at 3,900. The Bengals have given up 12 touchdowns to opposing tight ends already this season, over 800 yards. They just, like I said, I think you're really trying to exploit the linebackers and safeties more than you are the corners for the Bengals. So like anybody who's matched up against the linebackers and safeties, like those are the guys who should have really big weeks. My only concern with him is he hasn't been quite as involved lately as he was early in the season. I don't think he's had more than 6 targets since like week 2 or something. So I wish there's a little more volume there, but like in terms of matchup, it doesn't get any better than that one.
All right, now it's time for our favorite stacks of the week. And Dan, I'm going to let you lead us off here with your favorite stack of the week.
Yeah, and again, this one might be super popular. I really do like the Arizona double stack. I just think that you can get after the Jaguars through the air. I think that game has some sneaky shootout potential. Brissett's been playing really well. Michael Wilson's playing well. McBride has just been on a tear, 6 touchdowns in 5 games. So that's the number one. And then we mentioned both the Ravens and the Lions are the other two that I'm probably most interested in. Phil mentioned Flowers. I like Andrews and the Ravens stack. And then I think it's viable to go with both of the Lions wide receivers. Like if Goff does it through the air, those guys are fairly inexpensive. And with Laporta out, you kind of narrows the target tree there a little bit.
What do you have, Phil?
I'll go with the one that I gave out at the very beginning. Give me the returning Jackson Dart, who will still be throwing caution to the wind despite what his coaches are telling him. Stack him up with Theo Johnson, his tight end, and then play all the Lions on the way back. Play Gibbs, play Amon-Ra, and I don't know if you could fit Jameson Williams in there at that point. Play him too. Just play all the Lions.
Every line. Brock Wright, $3,000, playing all the snaps at tight end, all the Lions here. Yeah. Let's see. My favorite stack of the week. Dan, you really did a great job there, touching a lot of them.
3 of them.
You're good. You're good. Now, I think that I do have some concern with Quinnen Williams with Dallas's defense playing better with Lane Johnson out, with what we've seen from the Eagles so far. But I also see Jalen Hurts probably just about as low price as Jalen Hurts can get. And then you're sitting here, Saquon Barkley, similar conversation. You're sitting here, Devonta Smith had been very, very good, had a quiet week. I mean, you could load it in and just go Devonta Smith, AJ Brown, Jalen Hurts, and Saquon Barkley, and just go onslaught stack against the Dallas defense that has broken wide and has the ability to keep pushing that game. Discount plays of the week. Dan, you kind of knocked it out with Mitchell Tinsley. I don't know if you're going to go with that or not, but you go ahead and take your discount play of the week.
Yeah, I do like Tinsley. Again, I think he probably plays 75-80% of the snaps, if I had to guess. I think he gets 6 to 8 targets. And he was just like highlight reel after highlight reel in the preseason and throughout camp. And he was a guy that Burrow kind of stumped for. I'm like, we need to keep this guy. Because he came into camp like kind of, I won't say a long shot to make the team, but kind of on the outside looking in. And he was one of those guys who just, every chance they gave him, he made plays. And they were giving him more and more time with Burrow in the starting offense, like late in camp. So I think he makes a ton of sense at the minimum price in a game with some shootout potential there.
Phil, what are you going to go with?
My 3K crapper is Kadarrell Hodge, who I'm really not even sure is going to play. But I think that someone has to benefit on the Atlanta side from Drake London going out at wide receiver. Darnell Mooney has not been up to the task, and it looked like Hodge was ahead of Casey Washington when London went out last week, I think. But either way, we've seen him make some explosive plays before with Kirk Cousins as his quarterback. There's some familiarity there, and it's thin, but we're talking about 3K bottom of the barrel. So if I could go back and take Mitchell Tinsley now, I would.
How much was Mechie this week? I know you guys mentioned him.
3,300 for Mechie.
Yeah, that's an interesting one too.
Yeah, I know way too much about the Falcons. I cover them in the preseason, so the way that I see that stacking up so Casey Washington is a direct replacement for Darnell Mooney. They play the similar position at wide receiver, and then Kadarrell Hodge kind of slides in there for Drake London. David Sills, I think, is an interesting one to watch there with Kirk Cousins. They've got a strong connection between the two of them. He's kind of been his guy on the second team throughout the summer, and then Sills has been running strong as the wide receiver 3 there. I don't know if the volume is is actually there. But yeah, I think Hodge, when London was out, it schemed in to go to that position within the way the offense is built. I was a little bit tongue in cheek when you're talking about all the Lions, but Brock Wright at 3,000, just playing every single snap. He saw 4 targets last week. They were talking on the broadcast last week in the Eagles game about the Lions just kind of struggling in the red zone a little bit without Laporta, or missing Laporta in the red zone down there. Brock Wright's been utilized in the red zone before. I think that's a guy that if this breaks open, he could find the end zone a couple times at just 3,000 flat. That's all we got. So, best of luck. And I don't know if you guys have any parting shots that you want to impart on the people, but Dan, of course, we thank you so much for being here. If you maybe want to tell everybody what you work on week to week, so that, I mean, the Football Guys audience knows you very well. And if they don't, they definitely should, but we do appreciate it.
Yeah, so on Wednesdays, I do a DFS first look, which kind of breaks down some of the matchups, some of the stats we talked about today, defense first position. I calculate weekly boost, which kind of compares the team totals to point per game. And then it highlights some of my favorite plays on the slate and the top point per dollar guys on both DraftKings and FanDuel. On Friday, I do an underdog pick'em article with my favorite player props of the week. And then on Saturday morning, I have a FanDuel GPP article that I put a ton of work and time into. So that's mainly what I'm doing during the week on mostly DFS.
It's awesome. Thank you so much. Take care. Best luck, everybody.